Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to this BIAP workshop on knowledge and legal standards of proof. Let me introduce what the BIAP is, the Barcelona Institute of Analytic Philosophy. It is an inter-university research center involving research groups in the philosophy of science, epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, political philosophy, and philosophy of law. All these groups belong to the three Catalan universities, the University of Barcelona, the Pompeu Fabra University of Barcelona, and the University of Girona. In 2022, the BIAP received the highest recognition granted by the Spanish Ministry of Science to inter-university research centers, the designation as a María de Maeztu Unit of Excellence with a project on evidence. Our goal is precisely to study the notion of evidence and proof from the different philosophical perspectives mentioned earlier. This workshop is organized by work packages 2 and 6 of our project, led by the Political Philosophy and Law group at the Pompeu Fabra University, directed by José Juan Moreso, and our Philosophy of Law group in Girona. In Girona, we have been working on legal evidential reasoning with an epistemological perspective. Our colleagues of the Pompeu Fabra University bring a political philosophy lens to this analysis. Both perspectives, in any case, are clearly complementary. I don't want to extend my remarks further. I just want to thank you all for being here, especially our speakers, and give the floor to José Juan Moreso, representing the co-organizing group at the Pompeu Fabra University, who will also coordinate the first presentation of Juan Comesaña. Please, José Juan.
Thank you very much, Jordi. Good morning. My name is José Juan Moreso. I am professor of jurisprudence at the Pompeu Fabra University and responsible of the group Law and Philosophy, part of this project and this Center, Barcelona Institute of Analytic Philosophy. That's more or less an overlapping institution between the group Logos in philosophy in the university at the University of Barcelona and the legal evidence reasoning group in the University of Girona, and our group in law and philosophy between jurisprudence and political philosophy at Pompeu Fabra. And that's the clear explanation of Jordi. We are very happy to be here, and I am also happy to be in Girona because my first position as full professor was in Girona 30 years ago. That's very almost 30 years.
Yes, 30
almost, but yeah, that's and my memories of my stay in Girona was very from a very happy period of my life, and I have a very good memories of this period of my life in Girona. Well, then now to begin this workshop, this very interesting workshop, we have Professor Juan Comesaña of Rutgers University. You know, his very impressive academic trajectory, beginning at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, at the beginning in the education in philosophy, but after in American universities, in Brown is the PhD, no, in Brown University, but after in other universities in Wisconsin, Arizona, before then Rutgers. Rutgers, you know, it's a very important department in philosophy, one of the most relevant departments of philosophy in the world, and in this sense, it's a pleasure to have Juan among us. Juan, on the other hand, has a lot of publications in epistemology, very relevant. One of them, this is his criticism to the idea of the clause of safety in the notion of knowledge, very known contribution of Juan to the debate, and that's the Comesaña case in the literature. No, that's very important, and it's a pleasure to have today to begin this workshop. Juan explained something on knowledge and statistical evidence, and I am passing the floor to Juan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan Jose, and thank you, Jordi, and all the local organizers here. I'm very happy to be back in Girona. I was here last year and I enjoyed it immensely. So thank you for having me back, and I hope you have me back yet again soon. Yeah, so what I wanted to do was to, as I say here in the title, reassess a classic paper by Julie Thompson on liability and individualized evidence. My initial idea was to go beyond that, but as I reread Thompson's paper and the literature, the more recent literature around it, I realized that her paper was more subtle and complicated perhaps than people have realized, and that it was well worth getting clear on what exactly was she doing in that paper and why I thought some recent critics missed some of the crucial points of that paper and what she's doing. And towards the end, I want to push a little bit the line that that was my original idea against her, and see where that takes us. So the Thompson paper was published in 1986, and the motivation there are some of them real cases in the philosophy of law, some of them stylized cases afterwards, that have to do with cases where there is, as some people call it, merely statistical evidence of guilt. Right? So the stylized case, which is modeled on a real case, but the stylized case is the red cap versus blue caps case, where somebody is involved in an accident late at night out in the town, and let us suppose that it is known that it was a cab that caused the accident, but the person couldn't see what kind of cab it was. And there are only two cabs in town, two kinds of cabs, red cabs and blue cabs. And blue cab has 80%, say, of the cabs in town, and red cab only 20%. So the person sues the red cab company on the basis of that evidence, the evidence that, one, it was a cab that caused the accident, and two, 80% of the cabs out in the town that night were red cabs, say. And many people, by the way, not all, but many people feel that the kind of evidence offered in that case is insufficient for justifying a guilty verdict. And the first thing that one might think is that, oh, that's because the probability of guilt is not high enough. Although, of course, once you get into the realm of stylized cases, you can make it as high as you want and check whether that makes you feel any different about it. But something that Thompson points out, and that many people afterwards have also latched onto, is that, and this is a point that I also think is more complicated than either Thompson or later critics make it out to be. But the point is the following. Look, we would readily accept eyewitness testimony in that case. Somebody that said, I saw that it was a red cab that caused the accident. And yet, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, and it might be that the probability that the testifier was right is below, say, 80%. So why do we readily admit eyewitness testimony as justifying a guilty verdict, and we do not admit nakedly statistical evidence as justifying the same guilty evidence? Verdict. It cannot be the mere difference in probabilities, because eyewitness testimony can be less probable, make guilt less probable than merely statistical evidence. So that's the way that Thompson's paper starts. I think, actually, that it's a little bit more complicated, because eyewitness testimony, one way of thinking about it is it's conditionalizing on the prior that 80% of the cabs were red already. So the fact that this person says it was a red cab doesn't give you just the probability that his eyesight was working correctly, but it gives you that testimony conditionalized on the prior. So I do think that there is, if one wants a merely probabilistic account of why eyewitness testimony is preferable to mere statistical evidence, to put it that way, but that's just an aside. So that's the starting point of Thompson's paper. What makes the difference between, say, eyewitness testimony or other kinds of individualized evidence, as she goes on to call it, versus merely statistical evidence? And what she does in the paper is two things. The first one, and the one that has had by a large amount the greatest impact in the literature afterwards, is to give an account of individualized evidence. Right? What is it that makes, for instance, eyewitness testimony acceptable? What marks the distinction between that kind of evidence and merely statistical evidence? And she gives an account of that, which is largely in causalist terms, as we will see later on. That's one of the things that she does, but there's a very large portion of the paper where she does something else. Right? So that portion of the paper starts when she says, and now a little detour through epistemology. And it's 60% of the paper is that. And it has little to do with characterizing individualized evidence versus statistical evidence. What she's doing there is, given this distinction, given that this distinction exists, what is it for a jury to satisfy the burden of proof in a criminal or in a civil case? So those are two completely different things, and they are related, but they're not related to each other in the way that critics have assumed. That's going to be my main point in this talk. Okay, so the second thing that Thompson does is to give an account of what it takes for a jury to satisfy the burden of proof. And I think that some of the problems that recent critics have encountered with Thompson's paper comes from confusing these two things, thinking that her account of what it takes for a jury to satisfy the burden of proof just falls directly from her account of individualized evidence, and it doesn't. Right? So what critics assume, in other words, is that for a jury to satisfy the burden of proof, they have to have a sufficient amount of individualized evidence. That's all it takes. Okay? And that's not what she thinks. That's what that huge part of the paper that starts with saying, and now we detour through epistemology, is doing. It's doing something else. So Thompson's account of individualized evidence is the following. You have it on your handout. So say you have some evidence E of the defendant's guilt. What it takes for it to be individualized is that there be some kind of causal connection between E and the defendant's guilt. And by the way, she does it when she talks explicitly about individualized evidence. She gives more or less this definition that I'm going to give you in a second or so. But she generalizes it later on to not just causal connections between the evidence and the defendant's guilt, but what she calls a guarantee, which she thinks it's absent in cases of merely statistical evidence. And she thinks a causal connection is one way in which that guarantee can obtain, but it's not the only one, or so she leaves it open towards the middle of the paper. But just to give the straight causal account first, the idea is that maybe the evidence caused the defendant's guilt. That's one way in which E can be individualized evidence. Or maybe the defendant's guilt caused the evidence. It's another way in which the evidence can be individualized. So for instance, in the red cap case, if you have an eyewitness testimony, this is the way to interpret why that sort of evidence is individualized, because the fact that it was a red cap that caused the accident caused the retinas in the eyewitness to register that event, and then later on to be in a certain mental state, etc., etc. Or maybe both the defendant's guilt and the evidence have a common cause. That could be another way in which there is a guarantee between the evidence and the defendant's guilt. Right, so that's her account of individualized evidence. And you can see why that would mean that in the red cap case, if all you have to go on is that 80% of the caps at night out that night were red, that is not individualized evidence of the defendant's guilt, right? The red cap company in this case. So the second thing that she does, once she starts that detour through epistemology, is to talk about knowledge. And one thing that she notes there is that in a lottery case, we wouldn't take ourselves to know that we have, say, lost the lottery. Right? So you buy a ticket, you don't know yet who the winner is. Most likely, and depending on the kind of lottery it is, overwhelmingly likely you will lose. But many people take it that you don't know that your ticket is a loser. Right? So she starts by noticing that. That's the first step of the detour through epistemology. So what is missing, she thinks, is a guarantee that you are right. And what she means by that is that in this case, suppose that you were wrong. Right? Suppose that your ticket actually wins. She thinks there's a sense in which that would be surprising, but there's no explanation needed for why you won. It's not as if, and this is a fair lottery, right? And of course, there would be an explanation needed if it was rigged or something like that, but this is a fair lottery. And once you are told that what happened is that your ticket came up as a result of a random process, no further explanation is needed for why you were wrong. And she thinks that's what's missing in that case. That's the reason why you don't know. Right? If you knew, then there would be an explanation needed had you been wrong. Of course, if you knew, then you weren't wrong. But had you been wrong, an explanation would have been needed if you knew. So cases where you know are cases where it's no coincidence that you were right, that you had a guarantee in that case. So she connects the idea of having a guarantee with the idea of the need for an explanation had you been wrong. That's one of the things that she does. The second thing that she does, and sort of predates at least some of the literature on epistemological contextualism and other versions of shifty thresholds kinds of view, is to say, look, it's one thing to know something, and that's one kind of state that has certain conditions that have to obtain in order for you to know that something is the case, and it's another thing to claim that you know. When you claim that you know, you have to be in a position that is different, in some ways stronger and in some ways weaker than the position you in fact are in when you do know. To claim that you know, you have to be sure to a certain degree, this is where she anticipates a little bit of the contextualism debate, you have to be sure, to varying degrees, depending on the context, that you have a guarantee that P is true. Right? So you have to be sure that were you to be were you to be wrong, an explanation would be needed for why you're wrong. It would be surprising if you were wrong. So to know that P, you have to have a guarantee that P is true. To claim that you know that P, you have to be sure to the appropriate degree in thinking that you have a guarantee that P is true. By the way, all of the things that I'm going to say about Thompson here, I'm neither endorsing nor rejecting what she's saying for the purposes of this talk. I just want to put in context some of the objections that came afterwards. Some of the things I like, some of the things I don't, but that's irrelevant for what's going to come. So what she does for the second point in her paper, the second main thesis of her paper, is to piggyback on this idea that to claim to know that P requires being sure that you have a guarantee that P is true. And she says, what the jury is doing is different, in some ways more, in some ways less, than knowing that the defendant is guilty. What they're doing is analogous to, the argument here it's a little bit tenuous. It's not as crystal clear as one would expect from her, perhaps. But what she's doing is analogous to claiming that they know that the defendant is guilty. Or at least what they should do. What the jury should do in order to satisfy the relevant standard of proof is to be sure to the required degree that they have individualized evidence of guilt. To be justified to the required degree, say beyond a reasonable doubt, or more likely than not, that they have individualized evidence. So notice how it is related to having individualized evidence and to what it takes for some evidence to be individualized and not merely statistical, but is different from it. Right? Having individualized evidence doesn't, of the sufficient degree even, doesn't entail that the jury can satisfy the burden of proof, and the jury can satisfy the burden of proof without having individualized evidence, provided that they can be wrong in thinking that they are sure to the appropriate degree in believing that they do have individualized evidence. Right? So there's two things: having individualized evidence, and then it's being sure to the appropriate degree that they have individualized evidence. And this is the analogous thing to knowing that P is the case and claiming that P is the case, satisfying the norm for claiming that you know versus knowing. So her account is that a jury's guilty verdict satisfies the burden of proof if and only if that jury is justified, and this generalizes to finders of fact in general, it's justified in believing to the appropriate degree that it has individualized evidence of guilt. All right, so I think this is what I just said before is what critics miss. So two importantly related points. One is that Thompson's account of the satisfaction of the standard of proof is different from the one that critics assume that she has. And the one that critics assume that she has is having individualized evidence, or having the sufficient degree of individualized evidence, or something to that effect. But according to Thompson, a jury can have individualized evidence but still not satisfy the burden of proof, and vice versa. Should have added that there as well. All right, so we're on to section 2 on the other side of your handout. Some objections to Thompson that I think miss these 2 points. So, one sort of objection comes from Michael Bloom Tillman, And it has to do with the fact that he thinks there can be what he calls no-fault wrongful convictions. And a no-fault wrongful convictions is where a jury finds a defendant who is in fact innocent guilty. That's the wrongful part. But they do so in a way that is in some sense appropriate. Right? They had sufficient evidence to find the defendant guilty. So the jury had no fault in finding the defendant guilty, but it was a wrongful conviction. And by the way, different people will react differently to this objection, including some people in this room, for instance, will think, well, no, that's a different way of dealing with this objection having to do with the jury was excused, but they were not not at fault in some important sense, right? But the sort of the position from which Bloom-Tillman is coming is one where this objection has sufficient force behind it. But what he's thinking, but I think it misfires against Thompson regardless of your take on how to think about wrongful no-fault convictions, whether they really are no-fault or not. So what Bloom-Tillman is thinking is, look, according to Thompson, a no-fault guilty verdict requires individualized evidence. Because he's just assuming that's what she's doing in the paper. She's giving an account of individualized evidence, and then that's what it takes for you to give a no-fault conviction, is to have individualized evidence. But individualized evidence entails the defendant's guilt. Right? Why does he think this? Let me come back to that. But if you put those two together, then there cannot be, according to Thompson, no-fault wrongful convictions, because for them to be no fault, you have to have individualized evidence, and for them to be wrongful, the defendant has to be innocent, but this is the premise 2, individualized evidence entails guilt. So there cannot be, according to Thompson, no fault wrongful convictions. So I say here actually Bloom-Tillman is right about 2. I want to take it back a little bit. I think he's wrong about both 2 and 1. The part where he's wrong about 2 is less important because, as I said, well, actually both parts come from a not crystal clear part of Thompson's paper. But I think he should have read more carefully about point 1. But point 2 is also there, which is that she thinks it's not just causal evidence that is individualized evidence. It's not just cases where there's a causal relation of some kind between the evidence and the guilt, but cases where you have a guarantee, as she says, are also cases where you have evidence that is individualized in the right sense, that is not statistical, that can form the basis for a perfectly legitimate guilty verdict. And additional thing, although again she's not crystal clear about this, I think she leaves it open that you can have a guarantee that doesn't guarantee, right? That you can have evidence that offers a guarantee that P is true but doesn't entail it. So guarantee doesn't mean entailment for her. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated, and it gets into maybe unnecessary Thompson exegesis to bring this point out. So what he's really wrong about is premise 1. According to Thompson, you can have a no-fault guilty verdict because a proper guilty verdict requires not having individualized evidence, but being justified to the appropriate degree in thinking that you have individualized evidence. So, of course, when you do not, in fact, have individualized evidence, but you're justified, you're sure that you do, or you're justified in thinking to the appropriate degree that you do, then, according to Thompson, you satisfy the burden of proof, so you have a no-fault wrongful conviction. All right, so that was about no-fault wrongful convictions. I think, which, again, as I said, you have to have a certain epistemological perspective for that objection to even hit with you. The other two objections that I'm going to consider have to do with, are more direct. They are proposed just counterexamples to Thompson's account of individualized evidence. Right? So the first one is against the sufficiency of Thompson's account, and it comes again from Bloom-Tillmans, and the second one is against the necessity and comes from Sarah Moss. So here's a 2.2. We are now one of Bloom-Tillmans' cases. It's called the first of the gate crashes. Right? And it's supposed to be a variation on the Capps case, a variation where there is a causal relationship between the evidence and the guilt of the defendant. And the case goes as follows. Sunday afternoon, and Hannah decides to gate crash the local rodeo. As she climbs the fence, a large number of people in the ticket line get the same idea and follow her dubious example. More and more people start climbing the fence. Noticing that something is amiss, the organizers of the rodeo decide to take account of the people in the stadium. Realizing that many more people are in the arena than have paid admission, they decide to take action. They randomly pick Hannah and sue her for damages. The organizers' evidence is as follows. Hannah attended the Sunday afternoon event. She was seen and photographed on the main ranks. No tickets were issued at the entrance, so Hannah cannot be expected to own a ticket stub. That's important. Maybe we'll bring it up later. However, while 1,000 people were counted at the seats, only 300 paid for admission. No further evidence is presented in court. Okay. So Hannah was in fact the first to gate crash. And as a result of that, all the other gate crashers gate crashed. So she was the cause of the fact that 70% of the people in attendance didn't pay. That's what she caused. Of course, the organizers of the rodeo do not know this. This is crucial, right? They're not saying, oh, we're suing her because she was the cause of the rest of the people not paying. The evidence presented consists entirely of the following two facts. Hannah was at the rodeo, and 70% of the people at the rodeo didn't pay. That's the evidence that they are presenting. Now, is this individualized evidence or not? Well, it in fact is, Bloom-Tillmans claims, because the fact that Hannah was at the rodeo she was at the rodeo and therefore she climbed the fence, she was the first to climb the fence, caused the statistical fact that 70% of the people at the rodeo didn't pay. Had she not been at the rodeo, you could do like a quick counterfactual sensitivity test. You don't have to have a counterfactual account of causation, but you can do a quick counterfactual sensitivity test to check whether this causal claim makes sense. Had she not been at the rodeo, it wouldn't have happened that 70% of the people would not have paid. Okay? So Bloom-Tillmans is thinking, what is he thinking? He's thinking, well, the jury has individualized evidence. That's all it takes for the jury to issue a correct guilty verdict. Therefore, according to Thompson, the jury could issue a correct, perfectly fine guilty verdict in this case. But that's ridiculous. Because the evidence that the jury has is just completely analogous to the evidence the jury had in the Red Cap case. It's just evidence of the same sort that couldn't justify the guilty verdict, okay, according to Bloom-Tillmans. And again, I think he's right about this. We would be perplexed if the jury issued a guilty verdict in this case, and we would find it an incorrect verdict, I think. But again, what Bloom-Tillmans is doing is confusing Thompson's account of individualized evidence with her account of what it takes for the jury to satisfy the burden of proof. So there's other things that could be said here that are related to what I'm going to say. So one interesting point is that the evidence is de re causally related to the guilt of the accused, right? So the fact that Hannah was at the rodeo is in fact a cause of the statistical evidence, the statistical part of the evidence. But does the jury have individualized evidence? So Thompson doesn't, and Bloom-Tillman doesn't. They don't get into what it is to possess some evidence. And this is not just about whether it requires, say, knowledge versus merely justified beliefs or something like that. It's what it takes to possess individualized evidence in particular. What is it to have evidence that is causally related to the guilt of the defendant? The rare reading of having evidence that is causally related to the guilt of the defendant is as follows. The jury must possess evidence E, and evidence E must be causally related to the guilt of the defendant. Plausibly, though, what is required is a dedictor reading. What's required is that the jury possess evidence that they take correctly to be causally related to the guilt of the defendant. And so that's one possible avenue here of defense of Thompson, right? That's saying that Bloom-Tillman is having the rare reading that is not plausible on independent terms of what it is to possess individualized evidence. Maybe that's right. What I want to say is there's a more straightforward way of seeing that Thompson is not committed to saying that a guilty verdict would be justified, because the jury is not justified to any degree in thinking that they have individualized evidence. Right? So these two are related. This is related to the dedictor point. Right? As far as the jury is concerned, this is a case where all they have is merely statistical evidence. So they're justified to degree 0 or close to 0 in thinking that they have individualized evidence. So according to Thompson, they shouldn't issue a guilty verdict. All right. So Moses' spit in the sink case, which is supposed to be... So Bloom-Tillman's was against the sufficiency in the following sense. It's an attack on the idea that having individualized evidence is sufficient for a proper guilty verdict. And it fails because Thompson doesn't think that having individualized evidence is sufficient for a proper guilty verdict. So Moses' spit in the sink is a counterexample to the idea that having individualized evidence is necessary for a proper guilty verdict. And here I think it's interesting because I think she's actually wrong that according to Thompson, having individualized evidence is a necessary condition for a proper guilty verdict, but I don't think that's why her case fails. I think it's overdetermined why her case is not a really good objection to Thompson. So let me go through the case. I think the case is interesting and raises some questions that are interesting too, but I don't think it hits at the heart of Thompson's account. So the case is the following. Alice is found murdered in her bedroom. A detailed forensic study proves the following facts. So 3 facts. A, the murder took place in her apartment within the last month. B, no one except for Alice entered her apartment during that time, except for one person who left some spit in the bathroom sink. And C, the spit came from the defendant. Those are the 3 facts. And what Moses is thinking is, well, this is a pretty good case against the defendant. You have DNA evidence, maybe, that the defendant was the only one beside Alex that was in her apartment during the period when she was murdered. It's pretty good. But it's not good enough for Thompson because it's not individualized evidence. It's not individualized evidence because the spit being in the sink didn't cause the murder, right? The murder didn't cause the spit being in the sink, and she makes it clear that this is part of the evidence, right? It could have, I guess, but it didn't in this case. And there's no common cause between the evidence, the spit in the sink, and the murder. She says, for instance, maybe the murder was caused by jealousy and the spit in the sink was caused by a cough. So no common cause. But in fact, I think this is what she's wrong about. There is a common cause. And it's pretty easy to see. It's her entering the apartment. That's the common cause of the spit in the sink and the murder. So what Moss says about this is, no, that's a background condition. That's not a common cause. Okay, and she leaves it at that. And I think that's an interesting point. It raises interesting issues about whether Thompson's account should be generalized. And in fact, she does generalize it a little bit, as I said. She talks not just about causal connections, but guarantees. Right? And if we hold on to that, then her entering the home, her entering the apartment would be evidence of the right sort to provide a guarantee in this case. But the distinction between background conditions and causes cannot, whatever you think about that distinction, right? And the majority of people in metaphysics thinks is not a distinction that is grounded in deeply, interestingly different metaphysical facts. Right? So it leads to weird consequences, thinking that there's no interesting distinction between background conditions and causes. It leads, for instance, to the consequence that the Big Bang was the cause of everybody being here right now, and things to that effect. So once you accept the generalized similarity between background conditions and causes, you have some work to do if you're going to apply it, for instance, to legal epistemology. That much is right, I think. What is not right, I think, is the particular application in this case. It's obvious to me that her entering the apartment is a condition of the right source to provide individualized evidence in the way that Thompson is thinking. Okay, so I walk you through an important thing that I think is usually missed in Thompson's paper, which is her account of her account of what it takes for a jury to satisfy the burden of proof. It doesn't fall directly from her account of individualized evidence. It is not that for a jury to satisfy the burden of proof, they have to have individualized evidence to the right degree. That's not her account. Her account is that you have to be justified in thinking to the right degree that you have individualized evidence, for better or worse. That's her account. And I walk you through a couple of objections to her that miss this. Now, I do think that there is a real problem for Thompson here, and one that I am not sure whether it's a serious problem to begin with. I suspect that it is. And second, whether it's a serious problem, whether there's an easy fix for Thompson or not. The problem, I think, is the following. If what is required for a correct guilty verdict on the part of the jury is that the jury be justified to the appropriate degree, or that the jury be sure to the appropriate degree that they have individualized evidence, or that they have a guarantee that the defendant is guilty. Right? That condition can be satisfied by non-individualized evidence. Right? What justifies the jury in thinking that they do have individualized evidence can be non-individualized evidence. Right? Sort of the easiest way to figure this out, I thought for a while about a more realistic case, and I couldn't come up with one. So if that would be something that I would be most helpful for, if you give me a more realistic case. At one point I was thinking that maybe Tim's clogs cases could be used for this, but I didn't have enough time to sit down and think about it carefully. But the easiest way of thinking about it is as following. So you're the finder of fact And what you know is, okay, there are 100 cases minus one of those. And 85 of them, or whatever number you want, are cases where the finder of fact has individualized evidence. All right, I'm justified to way more than I need in order, for a civil case, right, to justified in thinking that I have individualized evidence. But that I take it. We would say, no, you cannot, there's no way you can issue a guilty verdict in that case. So again, let me tell you what the case is. And maybe actually you know what your evidence is too. I think you can add that to the case. So my evidence is E1, E2, E3, and moreover, this is part of my evidence too. I know that my case is one of a number, 90% of which are cases where there is individualized evidence. I think if you follow the letter of Thompson's account, you should be very comfortable issuing a guilty verdict, but you shouldn't. No way. So the obvious fix, which I'm not sure whether it works or not, is to say, no. You shouldn't do that. Just, write it by force on the account, right? So it's something like saying, no, you should be justified, but not on the basis of non-individualized evidence. That is to say, you should be justified on the basis of individualized evidence in thinking that you have a sufficient degree of individualized evidence. Right? That's the immediate fix that comes to mind. Of course, the problem here is that this invites just you're having non-individualized evidence that justifies you in believing that. And so it invites a regress. So one question is whether you could have something like, you have to be justified on grounds that are ultimately individualized in thinking that you have individualized evidence of guilt or something to that effect, or whether rather this issue shows that Thompson's account started off in the wrong way to begin with, and we should try something different. What we shouldn't do, I think is pretty clear, is go with what critics of Thompson thought her account was, just having individualized evidence. Right? That's clearly A, not her view, and B, not right, either, as critics rightly point out. What her view should be in light of the possibility of having non-individualized evidence, that you have individualized evidence, I'm not sure of, but that's where maybe I could use your help. Right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Now, open discussion.
So this is on the kind of things you were saying at the about the real problem.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure why as were such tricky cases are needed, because
Okay.
Given the definition of individualized evidence, won't it be that in lots of cases it will be virtually certain that if X is guilty, then there's individualized evidence of X's guilt? Because, just take a murder case, and let's assume that there are horrible stab wounds in the body, right? So if X is guilty of the murder, then those stab wounds are individualized evidence of X's guilt. And that means that, if you're justified to degree X in believing that X is guilty, you're also justified in believing to degree X that you have individualized individualized evidence of X's guilt, simply because all this evidence that you have about the effects of the murder, will automatically be individualized evidence, simply via the second clause. I mean, the defendant's guilt clause E. You know, so it seems like it actually individualized. If someone's guilty, then individualized evidence of their guilt comes very cheap in many cases.
Yeah, good, thank you. So, isn't that a big if? If the defendant is in fact guilty, so...
Yeah, but the point is, if you're justified to degree X in believing that they're guilty, you'll also be justified to degree X in believing that you have individualized evidence of their guilt.
Okay, so it would be something like this. It would be a case where you have non-individualized evidence of guilt plus the stab wounds. Something like that?
Well, I mean, the thing is, obviously, in any realistic case, there's a whole pile of evidence of different kinds. You'll have a mass of evidence, which of course includes the stab wounds, and that which justifies you to degree X in believing that X is guilty. I mean, but that's not supposed to be enough. I mean, that's why she's adding this extra stuff about individualized evidence. But if it's pretty much certain that if X is guilty, then you have individualized evidence of X's guilt.
Yeah.
Then, if you're justified in believing to degree X that X is guilty, then you're also justified in believing to degree X or X minus delta that you have individualized evidence of X's.
No, I got it, but I was thinking, in order for this to be a problem for Thompson, the part where you're justified in believing to degree X that the defendant is guilty, that has to be non-individualized. Because suppose it is individualized, that too, then that wouldn't, then a verdict of guilty is proper in that case.
Yeah, but we're just talking about a case where there's some statistical thing is going on. So, but maybe the because we're in some kind of red cap story, because there'll be all sorts of effects of the accident, and so once you have the justified belief in guilt, just caused by whatever the evidence is in the let's say some kind of red cap case, and then you will, and so some of that, so that if X is guilty in the red cap case, it's pretty much certain that some of your evidence is individualized evidence of X's guilt.
Yeah, good. So actually, the red cap case itself, you're thinking is a counterexample to. Yeah. Okay. So because you have evidence that it was a red cap to whatever you can play with the numbers to make it to whatever degree you want. And then there's the wounds to the victim caused by the cap. So the wounds are individualized evidence. So you're already justified to degree X in thinking that it was a red cap. And now you're justified to that degree in thinking that the wounds were caused by a red cap. Yeah. I think that's good. I think the point that I made about maybe, I'm not sure, but I gotta think about this. But the point that I made about the dicta reading of having individualized evidence might be relevant here. So you're not. Yeah, it's hard. I was thinking you're not justified maybe in thinking that that the wounds are individualized evidence. No.
I would have thought you're justified to the same degree. I mean, so I would have thought that you have it both de re and de dicta. Because it's not that you have some individualized evidence or other. I mean, it's this particular bit of evidence which if the person is guilty was caused by that person.
Yeah. Interesting. I have to think more. I mean that of course would be terrible for her. If
Yeah.
the initial red caps case was a problem for her account. What I'm sure of is that her account is not. You just have to have individualized evidence.
Yeah, no, I'm yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not. Maybe I have to. And I'm pretty sure. I mean, I read it very carefully, and it's a complicated paper, but I'm pretty sure what I say is her account is her account. So I gotta.
Yeah, I'm not challenging.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah.
I gotta think. Yeah. So just so that everybody is on board with Tim's question. So in the original red cap case, you are justified to degree 80%, say, and let's suppose that it's a civil case. Justified to degree 80% in believing that it was a red cap because 80% of caps are red. And that's not the only evidence. Maybe that's the difference between the way she presents the red cap case. That's not the only evidence you have. You have, in addition, the wounds to the victim. So you're justified in believing, to the same degree that you're justified in believing that the red cap did it, in thinking that the wounds were caused by the red cap. So you're justified to the appropriate degree in believing that you have individualized evidence. But of course, that just is the initial red cap case, so we don't want that consequence. Yeah, and I'm not sure what Thompson can say about that.
That's okay, Jordi.
Thank you, Juan, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I share the distinction between knowing that P and having a justified claim that one knows that P. However, in both your analysis of Thompson's thesis and Jung Tillman's thesis, there is a significant ambiguity that should be avoided. Specifically, that the jury is justified in believing to the degree X that it has an individualized evidence of guilt can mean either. One, the jury believes that it has individualized evidence of guilt, and that belief is justified to the degree X given the evidence available in the case. Or two, a rational jury would have a justified belief to the degree X that it has individualized evidence of guilt given the evidence available in the case.
Sorry, can you say the first one again?
The first one, the jury believes, in fact, the jury believes that it has individualized evidence of guilt, and that belief is justified to the degree X.
Okay.
Second, a rational jury could have a justified belief to the degree X that it has individualized evidence of guilt, given the evidence available in the case. The first option assumes that it is not possible to assert that John's guilt is proven to the degree X if the jury does not, in fact, have the belief that John is guilty. In this sense, the definition of what counts as proven would include a necessary condition dependent on the decision maker. The second option, on the other hand, that a rational jury would have a justified belief to the degree X that it has individualized evidence of guilt, is not dependent on the decision maker, making it intersubjectively verifiable. I believe the first interpretation would be mistaken because it is not only contextual to the type of case, but also dependent on the decision maker. The second interpretation, on the other hand, is contextual to the type of case, but not dependent on the decision maker. In any case, to adopt the second interpretation, you would need, I think, to make some adjustments in your presentation.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So you're thinking of a case where the decision maker doesn't believe that the defendant is guilty, but has, and maybe even knows, that they have individualized evidence to the appropriate degree or something like that. And it's justified in believing that. Okay, yeah, so you're thinking, well, they should issue a guilty verdict regardless of what they believe. I think that's true. They should. So one way of capturing that, I mean, an interesting practical question is whether they're going to or not. And I'm not sure. Many interesting issues that are raised by your question. One has to do with sort of Murian paradoxical situations in the vicinity, like what exactly is the finder of fact thinking? He's thinking all the evidence at my disposal clearly indicates that the defendant is guilty, but the defendant is not guilty. That flirts with Murian paradoxicality, and so indicates that perhaps the finder of fact is irrational. If they are, would they be guided at all by the norm to follow their evidence about what they believe? Who knows? And so there's the practical considerations here, and then there's the theoretical one. And I think on the theoretical side, maybe your point can be accommodated by thinking of the distinction between doxastic versus propositional justification. Right, so what matters first, I think, is that the jury have propositional justification for thinking that they have individualized evidence to the appropriate degree for Thompson. Whether they then go ahead and believe it or not, I mean, I'm not 100% convinced, but I think she would say it's secondary to whether they have the right to believe. So I think Thompson could agree with you that what's important is whether they in fact have evidence of the required kind.
Thank you. Marcos, again.
Thank you. So, my comment is more on the, I don't like, I guess for idiosyncratic reasons perhaps, the term individualized evidence. So I'm trying as hard as I can to think of other ways of expressing the thing, which I think I agree with. And I think there are two things. One is the kind of questions that we're asking and the conditions upon which we can use statistical evidence to answer that question. And this is the way I would like to differentiate the kind of cases in which we have individualized evidence and in which the cases in which we don't have it. So one thing that strikes me is that the condition upon which we can use statistical evidence to say things like we believe 80% that it's a red cap, or we believe that L is 70% went into the stadium in the other case, is that the observation is random, and it's not random. Why? Because every person that enters the building in the stadium has equal probability of having broken in, and we just extract one of them at random, then we can say that we have 80% chances to get it right. But we're not taking it at random, nor are we taking the cab at random. We don't know whether each cab has equal probability of being extracted in the lottery, so to speak. And think of the kind of evidence that you would want to believe that it's actually a random extraction, and you get to individualized evidence. You want to know the kind of things that would form individualized evidence. And also, we don't want that also for a particular reason, I guess. I mean, we don't want prosecutors to go about and randomly select people, neither, because that would decrease the probability of being convicted if you did a crime in a weird way. But that's a different reason. So, what do you think of that? I mean, using this idea that in order for statistical evidence to count for something, you've got to assume that the extraction was somehow random. But it's not. It's never. And in order, or in order to believe that, you have to go and look for kind of pieces of evidence that would actually look a lot like individualized evidence in Thompson's vocabulary.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I'm following exactly, so let me ask you the question back to you. So suppose that the way that the people of the rodeo decide is they use a genuinely random procedure to pick one of the people, and it happens to pick Hannah. Would that satisfy you? Would that be...
I mean, then, not really, because you don't, well, I mean, for two reasons. First, in order to know that it's random, we want individualized evidence. And it may not be, right? So, like, it's not like, Anna is not like a little ball in an urn, right? There might be differences. There might be people who cannot enter the building on a wheelchair. They could not break in if breaking in is jumping over the fence, unless somebody threw them. I don't know, but you see what I'm saying? It's not just little balls. And in order to get to the kind of evidence to make them as little balls, you want individualized evidence on Anna. The second reason is that if you do that, then, of course, if 70% of people broke the law in a huge crowd, then things already went bad. But if you do it random, it's 1 over, say, the 500 that are there at the stadium. It's 1 over the 1,000 that got in the stadium. That's not good deterrence anyways. So we don't want the criminal law to do that, because we want the criminal law to deter people. You see what I'm saying? I see the practical... It's not good deterrence. And it's a great incentive to get organized and commit crimes in a huge crowd, which is already there, of course.
Yeah.
And we don't want the criminal law to do that, but we may not get it. I mean, that's a political reason. It doesn't have to do with the epistemology of things.
Yeah.
But we may not even have to get to the political reason, because we have good, epistemic reasons for not relying on statistical evidence alone. Why? Because we want randomness with statistical evidence alone. And we don't have that. And
I don't see why you think we cannot have that. I mean, Hannah could have been picked by little balls too.
Yeah, but she's not a little ball.
No, she's not a little ball. But the price in the lottery is not a little ball.
In order for you to be sure that she's like a little ball in the experiment.
No, she doesn't have to be like a little ball. So the price in the lottery is not a little ball, it's the millions of dollars, right? But it's picked by a random procedure. So she has to be picked by a random procedure. She doesn't have to be.
You gotta be sure about the non-observable stuff. And in order to make sure of that, you need the model and you need evidence on Anna that makes it clear that she was picked at random. If she's different in any way than all the others, unless you have a model to account for the differences, it's not going to be random. That's why we do randomized controlled trials.
Yeah, suppose it is random. That was my first question back to you, right? So now what?
We have all little Annas and we pick them at random. Yeah, then I can believe that it's 8%. But
yeah,
we don't have all little Annas.
But are you happy with saying she's with issues?
For epistemic reasons, yes. For political reasons, no, because then it would be an incentive to make up gangs.
Oh, so you, from purely epistemic point of view, you say, sure, Hannah, go to jail.
Yes.
Okay.
If the crowd is all little Annas, exactly the same, and we make sure that they're actually in a big urn, and we pick one, then I'm okay with that.
Please don't be in my jury.
Wow. Federico Arena. Federico.
Thank you. Well, I am this discussion about individualized evidence is also present in the debate on stereotypes. I work on stereotypes. We're going to see that in the afternoon. And there the discussion is if about one kind of harm produced by the stereotype, that is violation of the duty to treat people as individuals. And one way to abide by the duties to use individual information instead of stereotypes. So there's more or less. Maybe the vocabulary is not exactly, has not exactly the same meaning, but I will present a case, and I would like to know what you think about a case that is used to say that individualized evidence is impossible without not individualized evidence. So statistical evidence is always needed in order to have individualized evidence. So maybe that is a problem for your last proposal. I think that the debate can be translated to the discussion on Thomson papers. So, for example, there is a case decided in 2010 by the European Court of Human Rights, ad hoc case against Hungary, and where this man with a mental illness claims that the exclusion of the election is legitimate because of his condition. And he accepts that...
Sorry, that the what of the election?
The exclusion. He cannot vote.
Okay.
Cannot vote. And the decision, the law that excludes people with mental illness is that generally people with mental illness is not in a condition to make conscious decisions. So he said, I accept that, but I want you to have individualized evidence that I satisfy that condition. And so one way to do that is to make him to take some tests, maybe in national history or maybe in propositional logic. And if he passes those tests, we may say that we have individualized evidence that he has or not the capacity to make conscious decisions. So what critics of individualized evidence in the case of stereotypes said is that in those cases we base our evidence also in statistical or generalizations or maybe stereotypes. That is how tests function. Okay, so and they generalize these to all cases. All cases of individualized evidence are based on statistical evidence, at least evidence about how our perception works, general causal relations. And so if that generalization is founded, maybe it's not possible to have individualized evidence without statistical evidence.
Good, yeah, thank you. This is related to Marco's first point about why does Thomson call it individualized? And she makes it clear that one reason is she doesn't want to say non-statistical or non-purely statistical or something like that, because she points out sometimes statistical evidence is individualized evidence. So if you have, for instance, statistical evidence, suppose that, and this is one of her cases, a woman brings a suit to her employer that she was denied a promotion because of her gender. And then you have statistical evidence showing that 99% of people in the C-suite in her company are male. But she thinks that could be individualized, that statistical evidence could be individualized evidence because it could have been caused, the rejection to promote her, the decision to not promote her, and these statistics could have a common cause, namely sexism. So that's why she calls it individualized evidence and not merely statistical, because she thinks statistical evidence can be individualized evidence. It can bear the right causal relation to the guilt of the defendant. And this is related to what you were saying, but I think, notice that, so think of this case. I think it's in some important respects similar to the one you were bringing in. So I know that my hand is gonna knock on the table in 1 second when I do it, right? Like that. Now, there was a statistical probability that it would have instead quantum tunneled through the table. very small, but non-zero statistical chance, physical chance that would have happened. Now, I don't think that my belief that my hand would have not quantum tunneled through the table is based on how low that chance was. My belief is based on, well, I mean, hard to say exactly on why, but toy model that is wrong for many reasons, but not relevant to what's going on here is, I made a correct inductive generalization from past cases. Right? That is not statistical. Right? It was just whatever inductive generalization is based on. Or I'm seeing the glasses right now. I know that they are my glasses and not Boltzmann glasses that were created randomly out of the fluctuation of particles, right? There's a very tiny probability that these are Boltzmann glasses and not my real glasses. But I know that they are my glasses because I see them, not because I think, oh, the chance that they are not my glasses is so low that therefore I base my belief that they are my real glasses on what low probability there is that they are not. That's not what I base my belief on. I base my belief on the fact that I see them or something to that effect. And that's what gives me knowledge that they are my real glasses. So I know, despite the very low probability that I am wrong, say, put in those terms. It's not that I know because there is a very low probability that I'm wrong. I don't base my belief on that. That very low probability is not what justifies me in thinking. It's the correct functioning of my eyesight that explains the justifying role here. So I think in the case, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think in the case of the tests, you could say something similar. So it's not that I'm relying, I know the statistics about these tests, but it's not that I think that this person, assuming that we agree that these tests do anything, right? But let's suppose, it's not that I'm thinking that the results of this test show that this person is in the right statistical category to vote. What I think is the results of this test show that this person has the right kind of cognitive capacities to vote. Not because, and I don't go through the intermediary statistical fact. I know all about the statistical facts, but I think that what resulted in his getting all the correct answers were his cognitive capacities. Of course, again, I know the statistical facts, but those are just accompanying facts. Those are not what justify me in believing that this person has the right to vote or whatever, in your case. That's one answer that comes to me, yeah.
That's okay. Diego Papayanis.
Thank you, Juan.
Perhaps if you want, sometimes in our seminars we distinguish between the hand and the finger. The finger is
finger abuse.
One point in the discussion, in the current discussion. If you want, if you put the finger, I give the word. Diego.
Thank you. I find it so complicated this discussion that I wouldn't raise a hand or finger. No, I have problems with the last part because I was thinking now the whole time about having evidence that I have evidence. And I find it really difficult, really abstract. I need some example because I understand what you say in the last part. I have non-individualized evidence that I have individualized evidence. But I don't see how this can happen in a jury. In order to have, if you need to rely on statistical evidence that you might have individualized evidence, in this case, that is because you don't have direct access to individualized evidence. So how can you be sure that you really have individualized evidence based on non-individualized evidence? I don't see that possible. I need an example to see how can this seems only like a theoretical possibility. Yeah, you may have, and with that statistical evidence that you have individualized evidence, then you are beyond the threshold of what that is required. But I don't know where you can provide some, I know it's difficult, but some kind of example or some additional guideline to understand it better. I don't really see how this works. Thank you.
So, yeah, thanks. So the cases I was thinking of, I don't know, you're finding facts in very trivial cases, and you're deciding 100 in 2 hours. And so you go to your clerk for advice and guidance, and the clerk said, well, look, 98% of them have individualized evidence. Yeah, that's a case where you can know, even before looking at what evidence you have, that you're 98% sure that you have individualized evidence of guilt. Those were the sort of cases I had in mind. I mean, so look, this is supposed to be a counterexample to Thompson, right? So the intuition you're supposed to have is you shouldn't, on that basis alone, issue a guilty verdict. Right? That's the idea. So if that's what you're feeling, you have the right feeling.
That's okay, Edgar.
Thank you, Juan, thank you both once for and my comment is the following. Well, it's a question, actually. Do you think, given the account that you have provided us in terms of Thompson's idea of having a guarantee, and making this explicit mention of an explanation needed if the proposition were false, would you agree with me in characterizing her account as being compatible with contemporary accounts of, for instance, normalcy of evidence or safety condition for factual findings, for instance? That's one question.
Certainly in that ballpark, yeah, and it's a precursor to those accounts, I think.
Kind of proto accounts of safety and normalcy.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. More specifically, explanation-based accounts of that, yeah.
And the second thing has to do with let's call it a more basic problem that I see with Thompson's account. Normally, what you expect from legal standards of proof, or the way we lawyers understand standards of proof, is that they tell us when the degree of support that evidence is providing to a certain claim is enough or sufficient in order for validly considering that proposition proven in a certain way, right?
Right.
But given the account that Thompson has, according to the account of how that burden is supposed to be met, you can have the following scenario. I think it not only theoretically but also in practical terms, in which you may believe barred or beyond all reasonable doubt, for instance, that being the standard of applying criminal procedures. Let us suppose that the jury thinks, or believes beyond all reasonable doubt, that it has individualized evidence by the account of Thompson,
yeah,
that the accused is guilty, but let us suppose that if they have, they think beyond all reasonable doubt that the individualized evidence supports the claim that the accused is guilty to a preponderance of the evidence. So,
oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
I mean, standards of proof are supposed to tell us that the sufficient degree in which evidence should support a claim, and in Thompson's view or account, this kind of gets blurred. And
okay, yeah.
No, you can be beyond a reasonable doubt sure that your evidence supports P, but maybe that your evidence supports P to a lower degree than the law requires.
What Thompson comes as close as you can come without doing it, to do it, is the following: is the burden of proof is satisfied when the jury is justified to the appropriate degree given by the burden of proof in thinking that they have a guarantee, or in thinking that they know. So the degree is in thinking that something factive obtains. Right? As I say, she doesn't put it that way, quite. The truth is, she doesn't put it. She does put it in the way that I say here. That's the official line. But sort of like there are pages and pages of discussion where you think, oh, this is what she's going to say. She's going to say you have to be justified to the appropriate degree in thinking that you know, right? Or something to that effect. I think that's the spirit of her view. I agree. You don't want 2 degrees of freedom where you can vary the burden of proof. Right? There's only one. And clearly what she intends is that the degree of freedom is in how sure you have to be that you have individualized evidence that guarantees guilt. That's what she's thinking. So when to claim that you know...
So guarantee has a built-in...
Factivity, yeah. So in claiming that you know, that's clear, right? And that's her analog throughout that part of the paper. Like, to claim that you know, you have to be, it's not enough to know, right? You have to be pretty sure that you know. How sure? Again, this is where, so this proto-contextualist musings as well, right? But you have to be sure that you know. And of course, you can be sure without knowing. That can happen too, so they come apart in both those ways that I said before. But what you have to be sure of is that you know. You don't have to be sure that maybe you know, or that you don't have to be sure that you're pretty sure that you know, or something like that, right? What you have to be sure of is that you know. So I think what she should have said is that what the jury has to do is be sure that they have a guarantee.
Be sure they have.
That's okay, Sven.
Yeah. Hi.
Hey Sven, how are you?
So this is a question for you and Tim, because when this counterexample was presented, you seem to assume that if it's very likely that the defendant is guilty, then you have justification for believing that he's guilty. Well, because you use the statistical evidence, right? I mean,
you're justified to a certain degree. So the statistical evidence justifies you to a certain degree in believing that they're guilty.
yeah, so that means so there's a certain, the statistical evidence makes it very likely that it's the red cap.
So that was the original red cap. Tim's addition was, look, so the original red cap, the statistical evidence justifies you to degree X in believing that they're guilty. It also justifies you in believing to the same degree
I know
that you have individualized evidence.
I misunderstood that transition. I was just thinking that given the letter of the proposal, it talks about justification, so you may just deny that if you are in this case that you have justification for thinking that the defendant is guilty.
So it's justified in believing to degree X. That's what you have to be.
Yeah, because you know that already from the lottery case that you wouldn't want to say that you're justified in thinking that your ticket is a loser. Right?
You're not justified, but you're just...
You can also have a more demanding notion of justification that gives you that verdict, that you, in the lottery case, you don't have a justification.
You could. What I'm trying to say is Thompson is clearly thinking of a degree notion here.
Well, you can still have degrees of justification, but still what you're measuring is something else. So,
yeah, but I think what she's thinking is you have to meet a threshold. That's all that has to happen. It's not about whether you believe or it's not about that. You have to have an amount of sufficient evidence. That's what she's thinking here. Right? And that you have in the red cap case. Because she's thinking, look, what happens in the red cap case is you are indeed justified to the appropriate degree thinking that the defendant is guilty. That happens. And actually another subtle thing in Thompson is she doesn't come out and say, I agree with the critics of purely statistical evidence. She says the case is complicated.
well,
But anyway, but what she's doing is...
If you say that, aren't you then committed to saying also that you have justification for thinking, for believing, that your ticket is a loser?
Yes, you have...
Okay. So you may have a notion of justification that doesn't give that verdict. And so why shouldn't Thompson...
That doesn't give what?
That doesn't give the verdict that you are justified in believing that your ticket is a loser.
So there's two questions. There's whether you're justified in believing full stop. And there's what degree degree of belief you're justified in having. So if you want, you can think about it in terms of credences. You gotta have a justified credence of the right degree in believing that you have a guarantee, something like that. So you can do it all in those terms. She actually has a discussion of whether you're justified in believing that you lose the lottery. And she says very interesting things. It's a super packed paper. She says, I think you can, but I think it's a verbal dispute, so let's say you're not. But I think that's what she's thinking. So in order for the initial setup of the paper to make sense, you have to think it in terms of a degree notion that you do satisfy in the initial red cap case. So you do satisfy it in this modification as well.
Yes, this goes back to the discussion you had with the gentleman at the back. If you're picking a ball from all the balls in urn are non-distinguishable. But in your hypothetical gate pressures case, how do we know that there is a 0.7 probability that Anna didn't pay for it? Because, for example, Hannah could be a very low-abiding person. So, unlike balls and these are individuals with different characteristics. So we can't assume that there's equal probability of each of them entering without paying for it. How do we respond to that? We do not know that there's 0.7.
Yeah, I mean, one straightforward response that doesn't get to the philosophical issues is there are legal requirements on what evidence you're allowed to consider. So you're allowed to consider, this is the stylized version of the case, that Hannah was one of the 1,000 people at the rodeo, 700 of which didn't pay. That's all you're allowed to consider. That's the evidence.
If that's all that you have,
yes.
You don't have knowledge that there's 0.7 probability.
You don't have knowledge?
That there's a 0.7 probability that she did not pay for.
I mean, let's assume you don't. But that's the evidence that you have, and the question is, should you
find a person liable without
knowing
that the person is liable?
Yeah, that is the question. Yeah, in a way. Yeah, and so the answer that Thompson wants to then give an account of why it's correct is no, but you shouldn't. So actually, Marco was disagreeing with you, and he was saying, no, if that's all your evidence, right, and you really are not allowed to go outside. In effect, what these legal restrictions are doing is fixing the reference class problem for you. They're saying, this is the reference class, that's all you're allowed to take into account. Again, it doesn't get at the interesting philosophical problems here, and maybe there's a justification for saying you shouldn't do that. You should resist that limitation, even as a jury. You should.
Marco has a finger of that.
Yeah. I think what you should answer is you distinguish it by asking the question that Thompson does. The causal relations between the evidence and guilt. That's what convinces you of the degree of randomness or whether there's no randomness. So this is the thing I was trying to say, and which is a little bit weird because then it gets so complicated with the distinction, which confuses a little bit. The causal connections between the evidence and the guilt is precisely what could make you sure that you're in a random situation and what you're not.
Oh.
So, in a sense,
okay. So is this what you're saying? So to know that the procedure was really random, you have to know about the actual causal mechanics of the.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so the example of the jury, the last example, is the best example for that. I think we can discuss it later. But I mean, in order to count that, you have to be sure that you weren't selected because some characteristics of it.
Yeah, I think she would allow for that. So the case could be constructed so that you know about the causal mechanism. You know, it was, I don't know, they use radioactive decay somehow, and that's how they pick Hannah. You could know that. I don't think it'll change.
What?
So they use some known or to be random procedure to select the gate crusher or the alleged gate crusher, and you know that. I think Thompson would say, yeah, still. I mean, you shouldn't convict him.
I forgot.
Yeah.
We can discuss it later. Yeah.
Dario.
Hi, thanks.
Yeah.
So I just have a question for clarification. So I was basically wondering whether it's consistent with your interpretation of Thompson's that can be misleading evidence of individualized evidence.
Yes.
So whenever I read Thompson's paper, I made the very same mistake that you sort of outlined at the beginning of the talk, because I always moved from a factive notion of individualized evidence. I know that you might doubt that she has a factive notion, but I think that, given the way she characterizes it, like this sort of causal interpretation of individualized evidence would be factive, but I always moved from this kind of factive notion of individualized evidence to a factive standard.
Right.
Now it looks as though once we make the distinction that you're urging us to make, we can, on the one hand, retain the factive notion of individualized evidence, but still recover the sense in which meeting the standard of proof is not a factive matter.
Yes.
And if we do this, then I think this opens up interesting values, we can sort of explain perhaps what's good about sort of no fault, wrongful conviction, what's bad about it. So I think it would be nice to have sort of the factive account of individualized evidence without a factive standard, because factive standards have sort of problems of their own. So I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, she most definitely has a non-factive account of meeting the standard of proof. Together with, so what I said is that there are subtle discussions about guarantee, what guarantee really means. But I think she does have a factive notion of individualized evidence.
And she does have
yeah, of individualized evidence, but not of meeting the standard of proof. So exactly right. So a factive account of individualized evidence with a non-factive account of what it is to meet the standard of proof. And sort of what Moss is doing in the paper where the split in the sink case appears is having, she's saying, oh, I know what's missing from cases, from lottery cases, really is knowledge. So what you need, at least in criminal cases, is to know that the defendant is guilty. But that's what beyond a reasonable doubt means. It means knowledge. So she combines sort of her account of non-statistical evidence together with her account of what it is to meet the burden of proof. And then for civil cases, she has a similar account, but sort of resting on her idea that the right level of credence can also amount to knowledge. But that's exactly right. This is what Thompson is doing.
Jaime.
Thank you, Juan. I'm not pretty sure that the fix of your solution about the problem of Marcus Thompson apply to all the cases or all the possibilities in cases in law. For example, parenthood suit. We have evidence, and DNA evidence, and we can reconstruct the evidence like not individualized, if better than statistical evidence. We have a percent of error than if you have a DNA evidence, you can commit an error, very, very, very small. But I think that is an statistical evidence. In a very sense of statistical evidence. So, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I don't know. That question, that is something that people in this literature note all the time. Right? What about DNA evidence? And what they say, I don't know. Why do they make that difference?
Or fingerprints.
Or fingerprints.
In one point, all individualized evidence you can reconstruct the individual evidence.
That's a different point. That's a different point, though, because that goes back to what I was saying about how I know that these are not Boltzmann glasses. You could set it up so that these glasses are in a class, most of which are Boltzmann glasses.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that I don't know that they are my glasses, right? So that there's a pretty solid line of defense there, which is to say, no, the way I know it is not by basing on the statistics, it's by looking. That's how I know. Maybe, I was thinking, maybe something like that could be set of DNA cases or fingerprints. What is it that... But I don't know. I don't know. What is the standard legal take on DNA evidence? Fine, right?
Yeah.
It is fine. You can convict on the basis of just the DNA evidence.
I don't know if just DNA evidence, but I'm pretty sure that almost the most judges convict only with it. For example, in parenthood suits,
Yeah.
without doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know. When the numbers get really high, then that people start to lose their nerve too. Right? So, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. So there's two questions here. The preliminary question is this really a case of merely statistical evidence? And as far as I know, it is. And the second one is why not the red cap then? Is it just the numbers? Is that it? That wouldn't be a very satisfying theoretical answer to the problem. So, so here's a question. Do you think we know in the DNA case that the defendant is the father?
I think that I know.
Yeah, on the basis of just the...
Yeah.
Whereas you don't think we know in the gate crashers. Make the numbers the same.
Make the numbers the same?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you do think we know. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's consistent. That's good.
Well, we have 5 minutes. I have a curiosity. If could you explain a bit more this question about the difficulties of distinguishing between causes and background condition?
Oh.
Because my doubt is because now the last years in jurisprudence increasingly people defend that one thing is the ground of one decision in the legal reasoning, and another the enable conditions, background conditions, and so on. And I have a lot of doubts about that. A lot of doubts, and your suggestion perhaps help me and help others to think about that in this direction.
Yeah. So my favorite case is, and I think this actually is, it has at least, I don't know if it's based, but it has analogs in real cases. You guys know the thirsty traveler case, right? You do? Oh, if you don't, I'm gonna blow your mind. So, there's a person that has two enemies. And this person, I mean, let's call him John. John is going out on a hiking trip where he needs his canteen full of water to survive. And the two enemies, A and B, they do the following, and they don't know about each other's plans. A replaces the water with sand in the canteen, and B drills a hole in the canteen. John doesn't notice any of this, goes out to the desert and dies. So who did it?
Who causes?
Well, there's two questions. Who should be sent to jail, I guess? Who should be found guilty? Who causes the death? There's more fine-grained questions. So, for instance, he died of thirst. That's an interesting point. So, what caused the death by thirst is another. What caused the death at this exact time? So, as sort of a practical fixed point, I think we should jail them both. And that tells me that the difference between, because how you think exactly about the distinction between causes and background conditions is going to make you say different things about who did what. Yeah, anyway.
One finger, sorry.
But my finger question is
That's okay, that's okay. The last question.
The highness doubt.
Oh yeah, DNA.
Not only DNA, but in DNA cases, the statistical question is about the nature of DNA evidence. But there is another type of cases in which the statistical question is about the nature of the case, not about the nature of the evidence, but about the case. Let's imagine a state seeking compensation from tobacco companies for the cost of healthcare treatments resulting from tobacco consumption. And in such of cases, the relevant evidence is purely statistical, such as the incidence of lung cancer among smokers compared to non-smokers. I think you need a disclaimer in your paper about this type of cases. It is not clear that all the cases legally relevant are cases in which it is involve an individual fact and not a statistical.
Yeah, so I mentioned already two quick things. That's a fair point. Remember that Thompson thinks statistical evidence can be individualized evidence. So, correlation is not causation, but enough correlation, particularly if you have, you eliminate confounds by more statistical analysis and stuff like that, that can be good enough evidence of causation. And it might be good enough to make you justified on even perhaps knowing that there is a causal link between tobacco and cancer, say. Anyway, yeah, but I agree, that's another interesting sort of case to consider. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.